Welcome. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Jim Falk. So just a week ago, we had a program talking about the pros and cons of nuclear power. And frankly, we barely scratched the surface. There was so much more that we wanted to bring out with our guest, who have certainly represented opposing views, that we thought we would do another program. In this program, we're going to be talking about how to handle nuclear waste. What more about the security, especially now that the United States government is talking about perhaps providing Saudi Arabia with the necessary technology to build a civil nuclear plant. So let's introduce our guests right now. First, joining us from right outside of Paris is Dr. Paul Dorfman. He's an associate fellow, a science policy research unit at the University of Sussex. He's also a member of the Irish Government Radiation Protection Advisory Committee and chairs the Nuclear Consulting Group, which brings together leading academics and experts in the fields of renewable energy technology, economics, and the environment. Now, here right next to me in our Dallas studio is Mark Nelson. He's the founder and managing director of Radiant Energy Group. That's a Chicago-based consulting firm that advises corporations, organizations on clean energy strategies. Mr. Nelson holds a master's in nuclear engineering from Cambridge University across the pond. So when you look at some of the obstacles that opponents use to nuclear power, one of the big ones, of course, is what do you do with all the waste? And I'd like to hear from both of you on that. Let's let you go first.
Sure. Well, nuclear waste is extremely small. Now, Paul, I'm sure, would quibble with me on what we're talking about with the nuclear waste. Almost every single conversation I've ever had around the world, and I've had thousands, about nuclear waste is concerned with the long-lived radioactive material coming out of the core of the reactor. So this nuclear waste is the spent fuel, highly radioactive, such that if you took the fuel out of a reactor and stood next to it, you would die quite rapidly. So after about 4.5 years in a normal reactor, fuel is moved to like a deep swimming pool next to the reactor. In that swimming pool, it gives off a nice blue glow and just sits there for between 4 and 8 years, depending on the nuclear plant. After that time, the high radioactivity has decayed enough that workers can safely, without experiencing radioactive dosages different from what you or I would experience in normal jobs, they take it out and they put it in canisters. These canisters are about 100 tons, and they use a crawling tank thing to just put these big waste canisters next to the nuclear plant. Now, as each waste canister represents an amount of fuel that powered millions of people for a few years, it means that all of the nuclear waste from nuclear reactors, the nuclear fuel from the nuclear reactors in the entire world, takes up so little space that a single facility that hosted it would be a few hundred acres.
What do you think about all this, Paul?
It has to be said that high-level nuclear radiation really needs to be taken very, very seriously. It's not the question of volume, it's the question of toxicity and heat. Now, this stuff, and we're not simply talking about high level, but in fact, some of the things that we're really talking about is intermediate level, which is a very significant amount of the stuff that's being created. But the high level stuff has to be isolated from the environment for up to 100,000, 300,000 years. So we're talking about a problem that at the moment has no solutions.
But I read about Finland's Onkalo facility. You both are familiar with that, I assume. Could we talk about that? Because that, I was reading, is an example of what is possible.
I've actually used the Onkalo waste facility bus stop when I toured it last year. So the Onkalo facility is down at about 400 meters of depth, so about just over 1,000 feet, and it's in granite bedrock. And the idea is that even though Finns are not scared of nuclear waste or nuclear energy, the idea is that they wanted to provide a demonstration of a legal and engineering pathway such that if all humans were wiped off the face of the earth, their fuel would be okay. You might ask yourself, what's that level of concern about? Putting that aside, the Finns are now opening this facility in a few months where they will be storing nuclear waste that by law they must be able to get back out if it becomes valuable in the future and they want it back out, or if they decide they want to move it to a new facility. And they're putting it down encased in a water-absorbent clay, wrapped around a copper container, wrapped around a iron container containing the fuel from their reactors.
Paul, let's hear what you say about this technology, because clearly it's, as I said, it's above my pay grade, but does it work?
That's very interesting, but let me just talk very, very briefly about Fukushima. So now I was on the same platform as Naoto Kan, who's the Prime Minister of Fukushima, Prime Minister of Japan at the time of Fukushima. After we spoke at the UK Parliament, we had dinner, and through an interpreter, he turned to me and he said, if the wind was in the wrong direction, we would have lost Tokyo. Now, this is the Prime Minister of Japan at time of Fukushima. Now, the point about Fukushima is that the majority of the pollution went out to sea. He told me if the wind was in the wrong direction, we would have lost Tokyo. Now, to turn to nuclear waste, now we're talking about 100 to 300,000 years here. Now, in terms of nuclear waste, people used to talk about the WIP facility in the US, down in New Mexico. WIP facility housed transuranic, some very problematic nuclides, and it worked very well for about 25 years until something went wrong. I was asked by the French government to advise them. On the last day, the French government asked me to advise them on the decommissioning of all of their nuclear reactors. And it was me against the head of EDF Nuclear. And strangely enough, I won. Who knew? But the point about all of this is what we've got here is a profound problem, and it's a collective problem, okay? And it needs to be taken very seriously.
How would you respond?
I absolutely agree, Dr. Dorfman, that it is a profound problem and we have to take it seriously, but there's almost a complete misunderstanding about what it means for a profound problem in nuclear to exist. People might think a profound problem is where you lose a country, or is it as bad as an airplane crash, or is it as bad as a car crash? The truth is, Chernobyl nuclear plant kept operating for 14 years. It produced more electricity 3 years in a row after the most famous and damaging nuclear accident ever. How is it that Chernobyl nuclear plant was able to keep operating with a workforce that was motivated to keep it running such that they protested the closure of their plant in the year 2000? Why is it that an independent Ukraine kept Chernobyl nuclear plant open despite the known flaws of Soviet design?
Now, wait, maybe I'm missing something, but didn't thousands of people have to leave their homes and have not been able to return?
Now we have a statement where why did they have to leave their homes? Why were they prevented from returning? Part of the problem in talking about nuclear energy is because people's expectation of risk and damage is so extreme compared to the scientific reality. Leaders like the Prime Minister of Japan inappropriately respond to accidents in ways that hurt people because of their own fear and inability to listen to scientific advice.
Well, let's stay on Chernobyl for just a minute, because I read the book about 2 months ago, so maybe there needs to be a sequel. But Paul, how do you respond to that? Did people overreact about Chernobyl?
Again, in terms of Chernobyl, there's a lot of discussion. Okay, and one must be open to discussion. As discussed, I essentially headed an absolutely key international government scientific advisory committee on this, and in the UK, and there was a significant amount of discussion about this. Our general thinking about this was that Chernobyl was a catastrophe. There are various issues around who died, who didn't die. There are various ways that people think about this. If you look at the Russians at the time, led by Gorbachev, so the Gorbachev scientists largely said that the cull from Chernobyl was very significant. Now that has been to a certain extent sort of overswayed by other forms of discussion. But when one's looking at nuclear, one's not simply talking about gross cancers and leukemias.
I lived in St. Petersburg, Russia, which gets its electricity from a nearby nuclear plant of a similar design, Chernobyl. Even today, there's a reason why people are returning to nuclear, and it's because it turns out it's providing what we desperately need without being as scary as we were told it would be.
And I want to spend a few minutes now talking and comparing Germany and France, because Germany has essentially, if I'm correct, closed all their nuclear facilities, and they did that largely after Fukushima.
They started after Fukushima Daiichi. They concluded it after Nord Stream 2 was destroyed.
And then France, which is continuing to invest heavily, if my understanding is correct, in nuclear plants. So I think the way to approach this, Paul, why don't you talk for a minute about Germany? And we only have a little bit of time. But let's compare these two countries because it's very different
You mean
approaches.
on energy performance or on culture or what?
Why is France pro-nuclear in building plants, finding the money, whether it's with government subsidy or private capital? Why did Germany take an opposite stance and get as far away from nuclear as possible? And where do the two populations stand? Paul, start first and let's have a conversation.
Okay, let's be clear about this. Okay, so I was asked by the French government to advise them on the decommissioning of all of their nuclear power plants, and it was me against the head of EDF France, the nuclear industry France, on the last day of their inquiry. Their inquiry agreed with me, okay, and it's proven. I can send you you can fact check that France has neither the technical capacity nor the money to decommission its nuclear reactors. Now, slipping into France itself, well, France now owes itself between 50 and 100 billion euros for the mandatory upgrade to make basic safety changes to its reactor fleet. Okay, 50 to 100 billion euros. Now, in
Paul,
terms
let me interrupt you real quickly and just ask this. What percentage of France's power comes from nuclear?
Okay, a very significant amount of France's power comes from nuclear, but you have to understand also that in 2022, half of all France's nuclear went offline with safety problems, and it started importing, and it was importing. In fact, Macron, the French president, stated quite clearly that Germany got France through that winter.
Let's talk more about France. He gave me the negative side. Give me the positive side
Sure.
of France.
So France continues to have much cheaper industrial electricity than Germany, which is why there's a very deep problem that Germany's having as one of the only economies in Europe that is shrinking when the rest of the European economies are growing. It used to be the other way around.
That's right.
In France, about 75% of their electricity comes from nuclear. Despite that, the current generation of leaders in France were raised to think of their own nuclear program as bad, and when they got into power from 2015 onwards, they set about attempting to destroy their nuclear plants. One of the things they did is take a really good plant on the German-French border, and they destroyed it right before the energy crisis in 2021. That and other issues has caused almost a total shift in the direction of France in re-embracing all of its nuclear plants, life extending them because they make such valuable energy. They're going to spend the money to extend the plants. The amount it costs to extend a nuclear plant in France is much higher than in America because part of their attempt to destroy their nuclear plants is to put rules on those plants that are not here in America, not because they protect the public, but because they're expected to help tear down the economic argument for the plant. So once you make
give us an example.
Sure. So in America, if a nuclear plant is operating well and achieves all of the things that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission says we should have learned from Fukushima Daiichi to protect a plant in a catastrophe, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission allows the company to continue to operate that plant safely. In France, they've decided that if there are advances in nuclear reactor construction, you must go backwards in time and add features to already built plants to meet the demands that the regulators put on the new plants. It's sort of a backfitting rule. Mm-hmm. Now, there can be different opinions about whether this is necessary, but considering that France is willing to, even under that circumstance, spend up to 1 billion or 2 billion euros per nuclear reactor to extend them for another 10, 20, or 40 years, that indicates the incredible value of the power coming from the nuclear plants. The owner of the nuclear plants is in debt because they were repeatedly raided like a piggy bank for the energy policies of France. They were the whipping boy. Because nuclear was unpopular, you could bleed the company and it would be considered an easy way to pay for your policies.
Paul is in France right now. I think you had something to add.
Yeah, okay. I mean, basically, none of the reactors in France now could get through current regulation. Basically, they could not be built now. In terms of where we are, in terms of the instability of the world, questions of protection of spent fuel ponds, protection of crash through into the reactors, these plants basically wouldn't hold up. So there's questions of, we're now starting to talk about military strategic problems. And the problem, of course, about nuclear is that when one goes off, then basically a lot of people lose their lives.
Germany bet on a natural gas pipeline from Russia that would replace all of its energy needs and give it time to, so went that they're to convert it to, right. And there was a president of the United States who strongly warned them in maybe rough terms that they were committing a grave error. Now that the natural gas pipeline was turned off by Russia, flowing nothing before it was destroyed, it was turned off by Russia before it was destroyed, that caused a change in attitude, not just in France, but in Germany towards nuclear power. The German government paused for a moment. They're a very anti-nuclear government at the moment, but they're also deeply unpopular. They paused. They thought maybe they should extend nuclear, and they extended the plants a bit. The German public is now not as strongly nuclear as the French public has become since that disaster, but the German public is now majority in favor of using nuclear energy to fight climate change.
All the German plants were shut down. Have they been, I guess the appropriate word would be decommissioned? Can they be brought back up?
Germany decommissions nuclear plants extremely slowly, and it means that although 2 years ago you could probably bring back 8 reactors at a reasonable time and pace, at the moment, probably I would say 3 of the reactors could be brought back within a year or two for a few $100 million.
Beyond inflation and other things like that, do Germans have to pay more now for electricity than they did before because of the shutdown of nuclear?
Absolutely. Germans pay less than they did at the height of the energy crisis, but they pay more than they did before the energy crisis of 2021. The nuclear plants in Germany were producing electricity at about 20 euros, 30 euros per megawatt hour. Now, you and I can't just buy that power. It has to go onto the grid, has to be blended with other power that goes up and down, has to be blended with the subsidies for the renewables. But I think this is the big thing that's happening in Germany. Nuclear plants paid subsidies to people's electricity bill for all practical purposes. The renewables that are replacing them get paid subsidies, not out of their bills. They're now putting German debt onto.
But Paul, people do look at their wallet. What is the impact on a person's wallet and spending power now that Germany has basically eliminated nuclear power?
Okay, let's get this straight. French nuclear electricity is vastly subsidized by the state. Okay, that's the reason. Okay, so that people pay their taxes go to government, the government subsidizes vastly the French nuclear electricity for all different kinds of reasons. Now, in terms of Germany, basically by the time everything was switched off, nuclear is absolutely marginal to Germany. And everything that nuclear has, as it were, lost has been replaced by renewables, plus. Now, in terms of power, renewables are I think the German government responded to Trump the other day in terms of where it was with its energy vendor. And I think you can look that up on social media. This sort of obsession with Germany as sort of not quite doing so well, there's no question about it. Gas from Russia, that's a real problem. Mm-hmm. Further problem, and a very real problem, is that currently America and Europe, including France, EDF, and certainly America, imports significant amounts of Russian-derived, via Kazakhstan, uranium to feed its reactors. So Russian, Kazakhstan uranium, which feeds about 42% of all reactors worldwide via Russian ports, is not embargoed.
None of us know what's going to happen in the Middle East, that's for sure. But there has been a great deal of discussion about Saudi Arabia getting support from the United States for a civil nuclear facility. And if for any reason the United States did not provide it, I think we could be pretty confident that Saudi Arabia would go somewhere else to get it.
Without a doubt.
Does that concern you?
I'm an American nuclear engineer by training, and I would love it if people bought American technology, and I would love it if American companies built it. I think that America belongs in nuclear. If there's going to be nuclear, America belongs in it. And I do think there should be nuclear power. Does it worry me that Saudi Arabia will have designs that won't work well? Not as much. A lot of the world's nuclear reactors are based on American designs. So they're going to be getting technology that's probably just fine. I'm worried from an economic competitive standpoint and also from a pride standpoint. I don't think I agree with many American experts who think that if Russia or China builds a nuclear plant, that gives those two countries a great deal of leverage over their customer. I think it's maybe more the opposite. As Paul mentioned, France spends an enormous amount of money building nuclear plants for other people. I don't think that the leverage is in the direction of France having control of Finland. I think it's Finland that had a lot of leverage over France in getting a great nuclear reactor at a bargain basement
Let's stay on
price.
Saudi Arabia. Paul, what are your concerns?
Well, Saudi Arabia has made it clear, very, very clear that any civil nuclear would be on the back of military nuclear. Now, I'm not a pacifist. We live in the real world. I've worked 10 years with the UK Ministry of Defence. However, there are significant concerns about what may happen in terms of a new Cold War in Saudi. If Saudi gets new nuclear, which they clearly will go with military. And this brings on another key issue. And the key issue is this. Okay, we live in a nuclear world. Okay, we need to defend ourselves. Okay, we need to be realistic about all of the problems and concerns that we have. But the idea of proliferating nuclear, okay, and that's unfortunately the idea that our colleague has, proliferating nuclear into new and developing states. The unfortunate truth about all of this is that it allows for increased military nuclear proliferation, and that is a real concern.
You know, one of the things that I know, Paul, you wrote about was by putting capital into nuclear facilities, we're taking capital away that could be used to build up renewables, especially in the global south. Do you still feel that way?
Yes, it's obvious. It's a thing called opportunity cost. Opportunity cost is a term which says that if you have this amount of money, what could you have done with it in the meantime? Okay. Now the problem with the nuclear is that it's just so incredibly expensive. It's up to 7 times more expensive than renewables, and that includes firming the admitted variability of renewables. In other words, you can cope with the variability of renewables via firming, via the various means that one has of firming. Okay, so the problem is this: it's not simply that nuclear is too late for the energy and climate crisis. It is obviously, given the fact that, according to government statistics, it takes between 14 and 17 years to produce just one nuclear power plant. It's far too expensive, and all of that money. And once global warming, global heating hits, we really will understand what resources we have and we don't have. Okay, All of that money can go to things that we can do now, here and now, to ameliorate the worst possibilities of the things that are facing us.
But I want to give you each 30 seconds to give your most convincing argument substantiating your position. We'll start with you.
France and Germany both decided they didn't like nuclear, but only France turned their mind around soon enough to save their nuclear plants. Now they have 1/8 of the carbon emissions from their electricity grid, while also having stronger economic growth and cheaper electricity for both households and industry by about 30% compared to Germany. That's because nuclear is the strongest energy source we've yet found, and if we have the responsibility and a can-do attitude to make best use of it, it will be the energy source that powers clean growth in the future.
Let's hear from Dr. Dorfman. You have the last word.
86% of all new power capacity generation worldwide last year was renewables with nuclear nowhere. Germany's coal, it's about, has come down to the same amount that they burned in the early 1960s. The reality is, according to the International Energy Agency, renewables will do the heavy lifting for net zero energy transition. It's a fact.
And as you've heard in our discussion in the last half hour, when you're talking about nuclear power, there are lots of pros and there's some cons. You're talking about life and death. You're talking about the risk of perhaps health problems, but you're also talking about the benefits. Where do we get our electricity on a cost-effective way? We hope you will continue to follow this subject as we will here on Perspectives Matter, where we talk about things that matter with people who care.